Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I'm Caroline Watson, Director of Transport and Urban Planning at C40 Cities. For those of you that don't know C40 Cities, we are a global network of the world's leading cities on climate action. So I'm incredibly grateful to be here this morning to chair what is an incredibly important discussion on transport decarbonisation, a beginning, not an end. So what is next? And I was invited to share a few words at the beginning just to set the context and set the scene and introduce the speakers. And I thought about what to say, and I think traditionally, I probably would have shared a couple of slides with some devastating extreme weather photos, of the awful stuff that's happening around the world, from California to Turkey, where the wildfires are blazing and the floods have been happening. But we're all familiar with those pictures, and to be honest, as tragic as it is, I don't feel that those images are personal enough. So last night I was scribbling some thoughts down that I wanted to share with you, and I'm going to read this out because it says what I wanted to say, but also warn you, I may be slightly emotional. I just returned from maternity leave. And this is my first event. My son is 1. In 2030, he'll be 10. In 2050, he'll just be 30 years old. And the IPCC report last week warns of the devastating impacts of climate change if we continue on our current trajectory. So for me, this feels incredibly personal. And in the words of the UN Secretary General, we're facing a code red for humanity. This is my son's future. I don't want him and his generation to suffer because of our inaction. I don't want him to face summers where some days it's too hot to play outside, our homes are so hot that we can't sleep, crops fail, leading to food shortages, refugees arrive en masse from countries where it's no longer viable to live due to extreme heat. I don't want summers like the ones that parts of Italy have faced this year, where it's been close to 50 degrees in Europe. Or for him to face winters where extreme flooding is the norm due to torrential rainfall and battered coastlines, like we've seen across the world from China to Germany. And if we don't significantly and rapidly reduce our emissions in the next decade, extreme weather events that we've seen once in 100 years will become not just the norm, but far more severe. It doesn't even bear thinking about to think that these events could get even worse. And it genuinely scares me when I think this could be my son's future. But the good news is that we know what we need to do, and it's not too late. But the window is closing, and it's closing fast. We know we need to halve emissions by the end of this decade. And we know that transport accounts for 27% of the UK greenhouse gas emissions, the largest of any sector. So today's discussion is so important. And today we're bringing together over almost 500 transport experts. And it's us who will collectively ensure that the UK's Transport Decarbonisation Plan is not the beginning of action, is not the end of action, but the beginning. And we have an opportunity to change track, to create a more active, healthier, and cleaner transport system. So as I said, I'm grateful to be here today, and we have 3 distinguished speakers who will be setting out their analysis of how transport decarbonisation can create the future that we want for all of our children. So just a little bit of admin before we hand over to hear from our speakers today. We'll be doing a Q&A session at the end when we've heard from each of the speakers. So there's a questions box on the right-hand side. So please type your questions in there as we go along, and I will pick them up after we've heard from the speakers. We're hearing today from Phil Goodwin, Emeritus Professor of Transport Policy at University College London and the University of West of England. And he'll be doing a double act with Jillian Anable, Professor of Transport and Energy at the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds. We'll then hear from David Connolly, Director of Technical Development at Systra, and then joining for the Q&A at the end, we have Chris Robinson, Associate from Systra as well. So I'd now like to hand over to our first speakers.
Good. Am I live? I hope so. Thank you, Carolyn, and congratulations, and for reminding us about our and other people's children and grandchildren. Can I have the first slide? For us, this presentation is episode 2 of a project we're working on about 2 futures. The first episode was a summary in the last issue of Local Transport Today, which some of you will have seen, and we'll keep working and developing at it until it's complete, so do keep in touch. Let's have the next slide. We'll touch on 3 reports. Decarbonising transport, which is big. The IPCC report, Climate Change 2021, coming out last week, which is even bigger. And our initial work on 2 futures, which is very much smaller. Next slide. Let's start with the IPCC report. It's hugely authoritative, and it tells us that climate change is not something for the distant future. It is now widespread, rapid, accelerating, unprecedented, due to human activities, visible everywhere and present. We're surrounded by climate change. The headlines in the papers have reminded us of that throughout the year. What we know is that this is the trajectory that the world is still on. And it's possible that it's too late to return to the climate we used to operate in. I'll come back to that later. Next slide, please. So where does decarbonising transport fit into that? Its declared intention is to set the path to a different future, but it's actually quite an elusive report. We called it a shot silk strategy, and I should explain what that means. Next slide. Shot silk, for those of you who don't know, is the material where the warp of the threads is one colour and the weft going in the other direction is a different colour. And the whole thing shifts and shimmers so it can look blue or green depending on where you're standing, or on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. It's not just that it's unclear or mistaken or confused, it's that there are 2 different messages. Now, maybe that's because it was written for different audiences, or maybe it was because different sections were drafted by different people. I don't know. You'll know the saying, perhaps, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Now, Jillian is known for her inspirational pessimism of the intellect, and I try to be a supporter of optimism of the will. So I'm going to hand over to her now for the next session.
Thank you very much, Phil, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to spend just a few minutes trying to see whether I can outline those 2 different weaves that run through the report, 2 different perspectives, 2 different messages, as Phil has explained. So firstly, let's talk about what's welcome in the plan. We've had a Climate Change Act since 2008, so in the UK, so 13 years, over which time the UK transport sector emissions haven't actually reduced. So the plan is long overdue. But we do have to welcome its arrival and the fact that it does indeed include some very important ideas, if not specific measures. These include a set of words and targets which have the potential to finally demote the role of the private car and possibly freight deliveries, at least in urban areas. It's quite clear that any messages that do exist in the report about reducing travel demand are very much relating to urban areas and potentially even the centre, really, of those areas. So there's languages of traffic reduction in urban areas and also a rather radical mode shift target. and that's the target is for half of all journeys by 2030 to be bus, walking and cycling. Private longer distance journeys are explicitly regarded, though, to be accommodated by private car travel. No suggestion of any mode shift there, whether from car to air or to other modes, whether from car to air to other modes. But there are some potential for improved options for the minority of long distance journeys that are undertaken by other means at the moment. So mention of integration with improved rail services and longer distance coach journeys. Freight's being thought of, I would suggest, a little bit more ambitiously in the plan with respect to mode shift over many different journey distances. No explicit indication of how much road space or how much mode shift or how much road space any of that potential mode shift from freight to other means is expected to free up for private car users. And it's also really welcome to see specifically decarbonisation principles linked with spatial planning. So there's, I would suggest here, quite slightly sort of new language that's being used around the planning agenda that moves us on a bit from what we have heard for many, many years, but not seen in action particularly, of the sort of more vague notions of joining up land use and transport planning. So the next slide, please. But as I say, we've had a Transport Climate Change Act for 13 years. The science of climate change has certainly been around for a lot longer than that, around 40 years, I would say, since the science has been could have been taken seriously. Transport emissions haven't reduced over that time for the UK. So now we have a target to reduce emissions as a whole economy by 68% by 2030, 78% by 2035. Those are the targets in the Climate Change Committee's 6th Carbon Budget report that was published just before Christmas last year. So transport has now only 10 years to achieve 50 years worth of reductions. And the really important point is that if we overshoot our carbon budgets by 2030, we will have blown it, or we will have blown what the IPCC are talking about in terms of keeping us within 1.5 or at least 2 degrees increases in warming. Actually, what's really scary, I think, about the most recent IPCC report, and Phil mentioned that things are accelerating, and that's a really important thing to grasp. The carbon budget that gives us the best odds of staying below 1.5 degrees C runs out in less than 5.5 years at current emission rates they have now calculated. And the really stark thing about that is that only a decade earlier, that's much more rapid than only a decade earlier. The UK has, if you work that all out, calculate it all through, the UK has less than 8 years of pre-COVID annual car emissions before it's used up all of its Paris compliant budget. And let's remember, that's the Paris compliant budget. We're looking at whatever comes out of COP in November, which is likely to be even more stringent. So continuous, incremental, steady change isn't an option. We've already stepped over the brink, as we've heard from both Caroline and Phil already. The longer we wait, the worse it will become. So I would suggest that if we're going to scrutinise the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, we really have to understand what it says we're going to achieve by 2030. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we know, don't we, that much of the emphasis, the rhetoric, and including also in the new plan, has been around electrification of the transport fleet, and particularly so far, at least, on private passenger cars. So in the context of the next 10 years, what can that achieve? Well, actually, in terms of decarbonisation, very little, I would suggest. Let's look at the graph on the left. this is data from Norway. We know that Norway is the front runner globally in terms of the uptake of electric cars into the fleet. It has been the front runner for now around a decade. It's up to well beyond 50% of new car sales that are electric, plug-in, have a plug. That translates though into only around, so far, around 10% of all cars on the road being electric. And even worse than that, it's even lower, an even lower proportion of miles that are travelled on an electric battery. And that's because, just like here, a huge proportion of the sales of electric cars in Norway have been plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. I term these as fake electric vehicles, and that's because a lot of the mileage that's undertaken in those cars is undertaken on the conventional fossil-fueled engine. The other worrying factor in terms of thinking about what we can achieve by accelerating the uptake of electric vehicles is that at the same time as we are focusing on increasing sales of EVs, the other end of the market that we're not paying any attention to or really trying to influence at all is growing larger. So the uptake of SUVs, or let's just say larger polluting vehicles, has accelerated over the last couple of decades, so that for every electric vehicle that's sold at the moment, at least 10 more of the largest, most polluting cars are sold at the other end of the market. And those vehicles are going to be on the road once they arrive for at least 15 years, with the rate, the scrappage, the length of time that cars are owned for on the roads is actually lengthening, which is another worrying factor. So if we allow those vehicles to be sold right up into the end of this decade, they're going to be running around on our roads right into the 2040s. So next slide, please. As I've mentioned, there is some what you might think to be quite radical mentions of traffic demand reduction in the report, but it's very muddled. It's kind of all over the place, as Phil was saying, perhaps written for a variety of different audiences. So there is explicit mention of lower traffic in urban areas, and that in itself is radical. There is a language of lower travel, of lower traffic in those areas. But also there's a language of it's okay, people won't have to stop doing what they're doing now. There's also explicit mention of the assumed additional demand that will come from electric vehicles, reducing motoring costs and leading to greater travel. There's also some messages around the radical behaviour changes that have happened during the COVID pandemic. And as you dig deeper into the report, not that the figures are provided for us in any detail, but you realise that there really is a very heavy reliance on much of those changes that happened to traffic or reductions to traffic will actually continue. At least half of the change that we saw last year will continue on in some form in order to help us reach our targets. But we already know, of course, that traffic has floated back. So the plan in that sense is already out of date. Next slide, please. So that brings us on to really having to look at this other weave that runs through the report. And I have to say, when I look at the report, this is the colour, this is the weave that I see, I'm afraid. Frankly, we have to say that the plan doesn't measure up to the urgency. There's a critical absence of a road traffic reduction target. So a target for trip mode share in urban areas does not necessarily lead to reductions in traffic. There's no mention of a stop to new road building until a review has been carried out. So there is a mention in the report of a review to the National Policy Statement, which will have an impact on thinking about the road investment strategy. But that review has been kicked down the road a little bit. And in the meantime, a lot of contracts can be let to put spades in the ground for road building programs and projects that actually were planned in a different era, I would suggest, than today. There's no explicit consideration of embodied emissions in the transport infrastructure, in the vehicles and the technologies that are being talked about. There's no discussion of a move away from individualized models of car owning and thinking about what size of vehicle fleet is actually required. There's a commitment to revise the National Planning Policy Framework. Sorry, there isn't a commitment to revise the National Planning Policy Framework. So, of course, we have some good language around planning, as I mentioned, but no actual commitments for the governance structures that do exist around that. There's no acknowledgement that spending needs to shift away radically from high carbon intensive activity to low carbon. There's no adoption of the Climate Change Committee's recommendations of a moratorium on airport expansion. There are no detailed measures for some of the things that I've outlined are welcome in the plan. For instance, how is the mode shift going to happen? What's the spend going to be like? Where? And similarly for the welcome targets around increasing car occupancy. So where are the early measures? Where are the things that actually are going to add up to radical reductions by 2030? We could have seen some things which we know would lead to very steep reductions early, the early action that really will count in this agenda. We could think about finally doing something about enforcing speed and even better still, reducing speed. We could think about an immediate ban on the most polluting vehicles, not waiting for these EV targets that are at least a decade away. And certainly there is so much that we need to think about in terms of pricing, road pricing, but also balancing the price signals that exist across the transport system between rail and air, for instance. And finally, given the timescales that I have outlined, it is shocking, I think, to see written in black and white in the report that the DfT has only committed to review this plan every 5 years. In 5 years' time, if we haven't made progress, we have, I'm afraid, already blown it. So if I can have the next slide, please. What's really disappointed me is the fact that the plan came with a chance to really outline some of the data that sits behind the analysis that the DfT needed to have done for this report, thinking about which measures we needed, by when, what the potential carbon reductions are, and as Phil will be going on to talk about, really discuss what the baseline is that we're now working to and the scenarios that we need to work to. The figure that you see here is directly taken from the report with some annotation from me. You can see how sort of fudged and fuzzy the trajectory lines are. Not only are the lines on the graph fuzzy, but no data exists. There are no actual numbers in the text or in an annex to explain what the trajectories are in hard terms. I have done literally an exercise of sitting and measuring across the graph, reading off the numbers, comparing to the Climate Change Committee's 6th budget report numbers, and can see that if we were to be able to continue at least 50% of the COVID-related traffic measures reduction that we saw over the last 18 months, then we could indeed be on track to meet what the CCC call their balanced pathway by 2010. But that is, as far as I understand it, completely reliant on us being able to return to most of the traffic reduction that we saw last year. So that is the scale of change that we are looking at and needing to achieve and maintain year on year over the next 10 years. So on that basis, I'll hand back to Phil to talk about these issues of baselines and trajectories.
Thanks, Jillian. And can we have the next slide, please? What we're postulating is that we are faced with two different real futures. I should explain these are not similar to the sensitivity calculations which are sometimes made around a preferred forecast or to the wide range of imaginative speculations which are sometimes used usefully in scenarios. Runaway climate change will happen if we don't find a way of stopping it. That's not an indication of how uncertain the future is. It's about as certain as anything that we can know. Its features, remembering that it's not about the temperature, it's about the effects of changing temperature. Progressively more serious effects on climate and on weather, on sea levels, on flooding, on mass population displacement, on food and other production chains, and on a changing economic geography of the country and the whole world. It's quite certainly involving reduced standards of living, a greater incidence of unpredicted emergencies, effects on coasts and on rivers and on floodplains, water drainage, sewage security, food supply and distribution, medical services. The exact extent and location of these features are highly uncertain, of course, depending on volatile factors, including the Gulf Stream and the jet stream, but their reality is certain. Now, the other future is the future that the world has decided to aim for, rightly, to commit itself to. It's possible, but it's not certain. It says that we can put limits to further climate change, and its features, we're arguing, will include a deep reduction by choice in fossil fuel road traffic and a halt to policies and infrastructure which embed car dependence. A critical part of that is played by the roads policy, where the message is not yet clear at all. Can I have the next slide? Now, decarbonising transport accepts that the current roads programme was designed before COVID, before in fact Brexit, and will be reviewed. But the tone suggests that the review will not change the substance. There is no pause or suspension while the review takes place, and there indeed seems to be a rush to sign contracts now. And it says, I'll read this, our ambitious roads programme reflects and will continue to reflect that in any imaginable circumstances, the clear majority of longer journeys, passenger and freight, will be made by road, and that rural, remote areas will always depend more heavily on roads. Now, that's an extraordinary statement. It's probably true that a majority of travel will remain by road under any futures, but it's completely irrelevant to the specification of the road programme, because every single scheme to increase road capacity in the current DfT road programme has been appraised on the basis of forecasts of increasing road traffic. Growth proceeding uninterrupted for around another 30 years and sustained at that high level for another 30 years beyond that. Now, that's longer than the entire period of carbon policy. Let's consider then what is the perspective for traffic implied by each of the two futures. Let's have the next slide, please. With runaway climate change, a review of the road programme would have to include traffic conditions and the functioning of networks which are very different from today. There will be less car use due to reduced incomes and other preoccupations. The economic geography will be different, therefore locations of travel demand will be different. And it's the wrong priorities for infrastructure, which will hardly need new roads, but will certainly need a vast programme of remedial measures to protect social necessities. On the other hand, if we succeed in limiting climate change, then a road review would need to consider the traffic reductions which will and have to be carried out in a way that welfare, health, social well-being and economic efficiency are provided by less carefully managed traffic. The economic geography will be different from today, but also different from that of runaway climate change. There will be a much more attention to shorter, local, sustainable transport. A road programme to provide for increased traffic is unnecessary, and there are better things to do with the money. So, what future could be assumed that would make the roads review come out with a conclusion of continuing the same road programme, RIS2, the current phase, maybe RIS3 and RIS4 as well. Let's have the next slide. It's a future where transport and traffic increases with smooth economic growth, but at the same time, both national and international economies remain broadly unaffected by either climate change or by policies to counter it. There is no weather in this projection. It would be a use of a special case of business as usual, where the trends are assumed to be as usual, but there are no radical changes in weather, no radical shifts in the location of population or activities, no shortages of food, no structural changes in employment, no escalating floods or fires, no forced migrations, and no climate crisis. That is the future which was assumed in, for example, 1990, and it proved untenable even then, though for reasons of congestion, not for reasons of climate. But it doesn't work now. If we try to follow that business as usual trajectory, we will bring about the climate change which will reverse it. This business as usual, as a policy, contains, in the old phrase, the seeds of its own destruction. Next slide, please. So what we're postulating is that there are two different pathways to traffic reduction. A very unpleasant one, forced by climate constraints on our economies and social life, a disruption of everything we have taken for granted. That's the red line. Or the possibility of a relatively pleasant pathway to traffic reduction, where we reduce traffic by design in a controlled way, making maximum use of the co-benefits of doing so on health and economic efficiency and quality of life and social interactions. And that's the blue line. The way the diagram is drawn speculates that if we succeeded in this transformation, we might decide to enable traffic, or some aspects of it, to increase somewhat again in the entirely electrified 2070s or 2080s. But we can't do that now. That's for future generations to decide, and maybe they won't want to. The black line is the old business as usual, a closed pathway. The world won't allow us to follow that path. So what do we do about this? How do we make any plans at all? How do we carry out the roads review and indeed all the other policy initiatives in a way which makes sense and gives value for money? Well, here's a suggestion. Let's have the next slide. Business as usual, which is the normal baseline for appraisal of policies and projects, must include the effects of expected climate change. And that means including climate change effects and impacts in the costs and benefits of the shortlisted options for each project, policy or programme being considered, including the counterfactual baseline on which all cost-benefit analysis is built. Given uncertainty, I suppose it may be necessary, based on climate risk, to consider multiple climate scenarios where climate change effects and impacts differ. The detail is very uncertain. Comparing options with adaptation measures, adaptation in climate policy is shorthand for measures like flood protection and so on to cope with living with climate change as far as might be possible and protecting against its worst consequences. Comparing options with adaptation measures to those without adaptation would allow us to recommend options which provide the best overall value given climate risks. Now think about that. Can it be done? What's wrong with it? By the way, I should explain the slightly complicated language of this slide compared with the simpler language that we've both tried to use in all the other slides, is because the entire slide is quoted from the revised Treasury Green Book, the fount of all principle and practice on matters of important appraisal. It's the Treasury's advice, not mine. But I welcome it entirely. I have no idea at all whether that is the sort of review of the road programme that's planned, but if it is, it could be the most important shift in official transport appraisal methodology for, well, the 50 years that cost-benefit studies have been carried out and the 40 years that we've known about climate change. So that's where we've got to in thinking about the two futures. Up to now, we've mostly been discussing in the country and in the world the impacts of transport on climate change. And there have been legal cases fought about that, and there will be more. But it might be that it is at least as important, maybe more important, to consider the reverse impact, the effects of climate change on transport and indeed on social and economic life. Because that may go in two different directions, every policy and project needs to be tested for its robustness against its contribution to both futures. So that's our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand back to the chair.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Jillian. Definitely eye-opening. I can't say it's made me feel better, but it's incredibly eye-opening and really important. And thank you so much that you've distilled that information for us, because I'm sure not many of us have had time to plough through the whole IPCC and whole UK decarbonisation transport plan. So I'm going to hand over now to David Connolly of Systra, who's going to talk to us next. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, I hope everybody can hear me. My name is David Connolly, and I have a variety of job titles. One of them is Director of Innovation, but I also now go under the badge of Director of New Mobility, because of that we see that very much that as the focus of how we can maintain mobility in a decarbonised future, basically. So thank you for your attention. Can I start off by acknowledging the author, or to the authors of this report, that I have the luxury of not needing to be either popular or re-elected in 3 years' time, and therefore I can be slightly more radical, perhaps is a word, in terms of how I would have, how I see the challenge of decarbonisation. And just to sort of start off to say, if I had time, I would have summarised the strategy or the plan with two images. One would be a large lorry full of carrots, and the second would be a hockey match with all the sticks removed, because I think the point of this strategy, or the main theme of this strategy, is it's all very positive, and we will try and incentivize the good behavior and absolutely no sign of any sticks to penalise or to discourage the continued use of fossil fuel, and that's a theme that runs through it. And I think it's very interesting from a transport planning perspective that it is so short of the need for, and the Committee for Climate Change, I think, we're more honest about the need for radical change, and I think this strategy is very short of the sticks that we are going to need to get anywhere close to what we need to achieve. But I say I have the luxury of not needing to be re-elected. But on the other side, the climate doesn't really care about local politics. It will change regardless of whether a transport minister gets re-elected or not. So I think we do need to face up to the fact that you need more sticks, and we will need more sticks to discourage the use of fossil fuels than perhaps appears in this plan. I'm just going to very quickly summarise the structure. I think most of you will, I hope, will have read or at least skim read the plan itself, but just for those of you who haven't, it comes in two main sections. One is effectively single mode consideration of the various modes: cycling, walking, freight, railways, etc. And then a second section where those modes come together in various different themes where they're multimodal considerations put together. And as I must say, it's a very well structured document. You can find what the areas you're looking for fairly quickly. So the themes are laid out there, and I say I do commend you or suggest to all the audience that you do read the strategy, because it is a good, interesting read to get you thinking. Next slide, please. So within the strategy, there are a total of 78 commitments grouped by those themes, and I'm not going to, you'll be glad to hear, not going to talk about them all, but I'm going to just give you some of the little thoughts I had as I went through them, and I listed them all and added my thoughts to the ones where I thought it was further clarification might be useful, basically, within the strategy. It starts off with the need or the implication that we're going to use cycling and walking as a big part of the solution. And again, with the carrots, with the investment in those modes to make them happen. I have a little bit of a bugbear with that, which is that they are always the short trips. That it's not the long distance 100-kilometre car trips or the 50-kilometre car trips that will be tackled by cycling and walking. And if you count mode share as a frequency of trips, then you can do great things with cycling and walking as a frequency of trips. But as a proportion of traffic, car traffic in particular, cycling and walking will never deal with what we need to do for climate change with the best will in the world. There are lots of reasons for doing more walking and cycling: congestion, health, well-being, local town air quality, city centre air quality, all good stuff. But walking and cycling will at best tackle the small percent of what's needed for traffic reduction. So the statistic I'll throw at you is that you can double cycling across the country as a whole and do whatever you need to do to achieve doubling of cycling, and you will have reduced, with a bit of luck and a following wind, you will have reduced car traffic emissions by 1%. So if you're going to get anywhere close to the 30, 40, 50% that we're going to need, it's just not, the cycling walking and cycling are not going to tackle climate change. They are useful and should be encouraged, but they are not the solution to climate change. So do not rely on a shiny cycling network. There was also one of the commitments was to deliver a world-class cycling and walking network for England by 2040, but no detail of how that would be defined or measured, which when we're doing appraisal, we're always told not to make objectives or statements that can't be quantified in terms of smart objectives. So that one could be doing with a little bit more definition of what a world-class cycling network would look like. And it would be great to have it, but it will not solve climate change or even scratch the surface of climate change on what's needed. Zero buses. There was a pilot scheme of a large number of electric buses, just as a pilot effectively, and I just would have been better. I think would have had more impact if you'd seen if every decent city in the UK had 10 buses that you could have been talking about in all your local press, rather than putting all your eggs in a Coventry basket. But I think electric buses will come, and I'm very, very much not concerned about the emissions from buses. They will very quickly get decarbonised out. Slightly harder for coaches, and there wasn't much mention of coaches, but obviously they will be harder because of the manufacturers and so forth, and I would see they'll be a lot slower than the bus fleet. There was quite a lot of talk about freight going to rail and electrifying the rail freight, and well, the whole of the rail network, but the rail freight network in particular. And I think there's a little bit of danger that you focus, it's quite expensive to do that and useful, but it is the amount of saving you would get in carbon is maybe not best cost benefit. I would need to be convinced that was the best place to focus. Certainly, you need all of your main lines to be electrified as quickly as you can, but the sort of back routes that are being used for rail freight, it's not necessarily proportional to focus on getting all of that electrified. And it might be actually that the electric fleet of HGVs, when you get there, solves some of that problem just as well, or just as cheaply. So I wouldn't oversell what you can do with rail freight if it was me. So there was lots of talk about moving to electric and so forth, but very little talk, and I think Jillian referred to it, there's absolutely no disincentive for buying a diesel vehicle at the minute, or a fossil fuel vehicle, which is going to be on the road for a median age of 15 years and emitting carbon for all of those years, even if you sell it and buy another electric one in 3 years' time. So any fossil fuel vehicle bought at the minute, you have bought a problem that is going to be there for 15 years, creating problems for us and our children and our grandchildren. So there should be much stronger message about you should not buy a new fossil fuel vehicle. What are you doing? And by the way, it's going to cost you more than the electric vehicle because of combination of tax and fuel price, would be my suggestion. But I say I don't need to be re-elected, so I can be as brave as I like on that front. There was a commitment to ensure that the UK's charging infrastructure will meet the demands of its users, which is quite a bold statement. It was unclear whether that has been quantified as to what that means, or even costed within an overall strategy, but it's certainly a bold statement, but it was slightly wishful thinking, I suspect, but it would be good if it can be delivered, and we'll watch that one with interest. The whole area of EV charging is one of my hobby horses, which I can bore you with at another time. And there was also within the traffic review, there was a suggestion that we would invest a lot in traffic signals in urban areas to make sure that traffic flows freely. I would suggest that there is therefore a risk that if you do that, that you will generate more traffic until it doesn't flow smoothly, and you have now got more congested traffic rather than free-flowing traffic. So very much care, or a lot of care needed to avoid spending money getting traffic to flow freely in urban areas is a very strange objective within a carbon strategy. Aviation was decarbonisation and biofuel. Absolutely no mention of the merits of flying less, and it's just a scandalous gap, basically, to say that you can fly about as much as you like, basically. I mean, I understand with COVID and things that you probably can't be too bullish about telling people not to fly places, but from the aviation industry, but it was just very strange not to suggest anywhere in the document that you might want to fly less often and less far and use other modes. Next slide, please. A few more themes then down the left, a few more of my thoughts down the right. There was a quite ambitious targets, and I think more ambitious than I'd seen, for the electrification or hydrogenification, whatever the word is, to get zero emission HGVs. I'm not totally sure that the manufacturer of HGVs is going to meet that, and obviously we have no control over that market. So I think it's quite ambitious, and it would be very worth, as Phil said, quite worth monitoring some of these things on an annual basis rather than just hoping, because I think there was too much reliance on electric freight vehicles. I could be wrong, but it seemed quite ambitious to get to the targets of 100% electrics of new sales by not very far from now. Again, a wee bit of promotion of rail and inland waterways. I'm not convinced that that's the best place to focus. It's a bit niche, I think, and it's not at all obvious that you'll save much in the way of carbon, basically. Whereas if you had an entirely electric goods vehicle fleet, or sorry, hydrogen more likely vehicle fleet, you might find that got you where you need to be just as quickly. There was no mention, again, lack of sticks. People ordering things for next day delivery, costing them nothing, or effectively free next day delivery is generating good vehicle traffic. That's just not quite scandalous, but it's getting close to it. So why are we not tackling that as a government policy, or a hearts and minds campaign at the very best? Just because it generates needless vehicle kilometers that could wait. You don't really need your duster tomorrow, basically. So just that, what next day delivery should have had a little stick attached to it, perhaps. No mention or very little mention of embedded carbon, so lots of new local transport systems to encourage people, but the appraisal will need to make sure that that includes the embedded carbon, so you don't just generate carbon footprint by building lots of concrete structures, basically. So the appraisal will need to look at embedded carbon, like whole life carbon. There's commitments of spatial planning. It wasn't clear whether that was just focusing on new developments or whether there's going to be any money and enthusiasm allocated to fixing the car dominance of existing developments in terms of trying to convert them to a 20-minute neighbourhood sort of idea rather than just tinkering around the edges with new development. And I think it would be better to be bold and say that we need to stop car dependence everywhere, not just in new developments. And perhaps that was meant, it wasn't clear from my reading of the strategy. And I think fundamental to how in terms of new schemes, the whole appraisal of carbon, decarbonisation, burning fossil fuels and stuff will be crucial, basically, because that will determine the success or failure of every scheme that adds or subtracts from the carbon budget pile. A little bit of talk in the strategy about low carbon fuels, so biofuels and the like, but no real mention of any commitments within that to a higher biofuel content, which I think will be important just in terms of until the emission technology catches up. So I would like to have seen some commitment to say that we will get to a percentage of diesel in particular having a bio content. Now there's pluses and minuses to that, and I'm quite happy to see the Q&A on that, but generally a little bit more commitment to not burning fossil fuels even if you are still driving a diesel truck, basically. And finally, my next slide please. So this one, I've now listed the commitments because I was getting more interested by this stage and getting more into detail. So this is under the mode choice, better efficiency theme, which would be my area of specialism. And here is the list of commitments, and I won't go through them all, you'll be glad to hear, but my thoughts down the right are linked to each of those commitments. So the ones where I have a thought worth sharing with you, a commitment to increase average road vehicle occupancy as a way, so for those trips that you have to do by car, can you take somebody with you even if they don't want to go? It seemed to the implication. I thought it was a bit vague as to how that would be achieved. What would the target be? And I would come back to my stick. If you made the cost of burning fossil fuel much higher than it is at the minute, and owning a vehicle that burns fossil fuel much higher with fiscal measures and the price of fossil fuel, basically, you could achieve that because you would stop people making needless car journeys, and they would do 2 trips when they needed to use it. And the more you can make the need to pay that cost at the time of the journey, the better, basically, because that's part of the problem from a mode choice behavior, is that it's too easy to get into the car with its full tank of petrol. You don't think about the road tax and the insurance and the maintenance and the petrol for your journeys, and therefore the poor old public transport or the walking doesn't get a fair share of the mode split. There was a mention to consult on a mobility as a service code of practice, and I think there's a big issue there that if you generate or if you allow new mobility to become car-based taxi, Uber, dial a ride, whatever it is, cars turning up whenever you need them and costing very little, you will not generate some of those might be electric vehicles, but you would be much better to have not got to that situation with the new mobility that's being promoted by mass and the like. And I think we do need to grab that as to have a policy as what you want that new mobility to look like, and it should not be car based, basically, and it should be targeting carbon as its #1 objective, and not the profits of whoever it is providing that new mobility for you. So that code of practice and getting the grip of new mobility is key. Talk about electric scooters, I'm not even going to mention that, it's just so trivial from a carbon emissions perspective. There was quite a useful tool that's worth looking up in terms of emissions by mode for various different journeys. Just the one air of caution is that that's based on the average occupancy of the various public transport modes, which might not be right if you've got an empty bus driving, which may or may not be fossil fuel friendly. So some of those sums that are done in terms of the carbon footprint of travelling from Bristol to Edinburgh or wherever by different modes are assuming typical average occupancy rates of planes and trains and buses. So there's a little bit of a simplification there, but quite a useful tool, and I would commend it to you, basically. And then again, these carrots coming in, let's give you incentives for traveling, business and community and blah blah blah, new sustainable travel reward. Why not just put the price of petrol or diesel up, basically? Similarly, there's other things, we will commend business to do this and that. Just put the cost of the use of fossil fuel up so much that people notice and travel more sustainably as a result. Two more finally, just to finish. The commute zero, I think, is something we will keep an eye on as transport planners. It wasn't clear from the strategy whether there's budget allocated to that or how much budget, and therefore how effective it will be, and we'll keep an eye on that one. And then finally, there was a suggestion that the rural strategy wasn't really being dealt with here. There was another document, and we wait with interest to see what that future transport rural strategy has in it when it comes out. That's it. A bit critical, but I think we have to be, because it is so important, as the other speakers have said. But that's my penny's worth for what it's worth. Probably a penny. Thanks for listening.
Great, thank you so much, David. That was incredibly useful for me, because I have to say I haven't been through it with a fine-tooth comb, so it was really useful analysis, and also to hear your commentary on it as well. So thank you. There are lots of questions we have in the question box, which is fantastic. It shows that people have been really engaged, and we need everybody to be engaged on this topic because it is so fundamentally important. I'm actually going to start with James Harkin's question about black carbon, because I think this is a really interesting one. And can we just make sure, thank you to all the speakers for switching their cameras on. Could you also unmute yourselves as well? And Chris is joining us for the Q&A as well. So hello, Chris. So there's a question here about black carbon. Road tyre dust produced by rubber tyres contains on average 35% black carbon and produces a significant tonnage, especially in built-up areas. So where is black carbon, or tyres particularly, in the decarbonising transport strategy? And are these emissions included in the national figures? So I feel a bit like this is a quiz show and you're my panel, so fingers on the buzzers. Who wants to answer the question about black carbon and tyres? Anybody feel they're an expert in this topic?
I will only pipe up and say that it's an interesting question. I have heard it referred to as black carbon. I've heard it mentioned, I think, more frequently in terms of particulates and the sort of increasingly minute size of the particulate matter, unless I'm getting confused. So I don't know the relationship between that source of emissions and greenhouse gas inventory. It is not mentioned, to my knowledge, in the plan. Indeed, the fact that even electric vehicles will be producing these kind of emissions from, as the question says, the tyres and the road kick up, is I think one of those issues that's bubbling up to be sort of the next big battleground.
Yeah, I think it's very much an air quality, urban air quality issue, rather than what it adds to the carbon footprint of travel or whatever. It's the carbon, if you like, is captured in the tyre, and whether it degrades 50 years later or 5 years later on a roadside isn't the point. It's, the carbon is embedded in the tyre effectively from a carbon inventory point of view. But we should have city centres where there is no traffic, either electric or otherwise, basically, and that's what you're aiming for in the city centres. But that again is not the problem with the carbon, which is the total amount of fossil fuel burnt across the country on the motorways and the trunk roads and everywhere else. The urban town centres is an air quality problem, very important, but it's not a big issue for carbon, in my humble opinion.
Okay, great. Well, I think it's a really sensible question and something that we need to keep an eye on, because what we're all trying to avoid is replace one problem with another, and I think it's just another argument to see more people on their feet, as well as obviously the health issues associated with sitting in vehicles all the time. So that's my tuppence worth. I've got a question here for Phil. Could you elaborate a little bit more, Phil, on how your proposed changes in road planning appraisal could lead to a halt of road building, and how a mere halt of road building could lead to your preferred future?
I think the problem we've got is that road appraisal, or the entire apparatus of forecasting, cost benefit studies, appraisal and so on, has been used in such a way that it has the appearance of a rigorous scientific value-free system, but the practice isn't like that. And in fact, there are many presumptions built into the appraisal system at the moment of the way it's done, which have given an unnecessary and unreasonable boost to the appearance that large-scale road building is actually good for travel and good for the economy and good for social life. And what we need to work towards is an understanding that when you look at the bigger picture, that's not necessarily true. Now, some people have taken the view that appraisal as a process, the whole apparatus, is so biased and so value-ridden that it's better not to do it at all. That one should take political decisions based on the strategy that you collectively want society to go in. And I've got some sympathy with that, but you know, we're all victims of our background, and I've brought up as someone who believed that the scientific forms of appraisal can actually be useful, can be useful rather than are. Now, the discussion about the business as usual and the baseline is important in appraisal for this reason, that all costs and benefits of projects in the system that we've built up over 50 years or more are calculated by comparison with a projection of a baseline of what you would do if you weren't doing this, what would happen if you weren't doing this project. And then the costs and the benefits are compared with that without case, sometimes called a do minimum case or a do nothing case or a business as usual case. And it leads to all sorts of odd effects. Values of time, which usually dominates road appraisal, are calculated by estimating the time that travel would take with the congestion if you didn't have a road project, with the rather lower time that it's supposed to take if you do have the road project. Because it's all compared against a base of a forecast of increasing traffic, you can get the bizarre consequence that you're giving a very large amount of so-called value to the value of time savings, even when travel is getting slower. And that's a perverse result. Everybody knows it's perverse. You get promises, this will save 2 minutes in 2030 or 2050, and it won't, because you'll be traveling slower in 2030 or 2050 than now because of the assumed traffic case. And all that is constructed in a framework where what you assume about the without case dominates the conclusions of what you recommend on the with case, whichever the with is, with a road project or with a rail project or with a traffic scheme or whatever. And that's the nature of the specific argument which I alluded to at the end. The without case now, the business as usual case, cannot be assumed to be uninterrupted, smooth traffic growth indefinitely into the future. And if you don't assume that, the case that you need extra road schemes simply in order to cope with increased traffic falls to pieces. So that's the nature of the argument. It's maybe a technical argument that is not to everybody's taste. Some people say, look, it's much simpler than that. We've got to reduce carbon and we'll do what it takes to get there. And I've got a lot of sympathy with that. I mean, it speaks to an impatience with the appearance of science and rigour, which it doesn't really deserve. So I don't want to rule out that approach. But I do think that if appraisal is going to be carried out, where the Department for Transport is concerned, it will be carried out. It has to be done in a way which doesn't artificially boost the benefits of road building and artificially depress all the costs of doing so, which is the situation that we're in. As a start of the answer, I mean, it is a much bigger issue to this Treasury recommendation that I put up on the screen. If it's taken seriously, which I really think it will do, will require a different practice of all the traffic consultants who do forecasts and appraisal. They're going to have to completely rewrite their models, and maybe that's good for business and maybe it isn't. But I think it's necessary if we're going to have the appearance of appraisal in the transport system. Meanwhile, as a sort of final thought, there's other things we can do which don't depend on such a complicated vision. We are going to have to think of everything we do in transport. A, does this make sense if climate change gets worse and worse, that it might do? And B, does this make sense to stop climate change getting worse and worse? And really, we want our initiatives to pass both tests. And it seems to me that's the core of a new appraisal system.
Yep, thanks,
Can I
Phil.
just,
Yes, please
sorry,
do.
can I just come in there as well? Just very quick thought to add to that. I agree with everything Phil's just said. There is the other issue which DFT, after some consultation, has just increased the appraisal period length for transformational schemes from 60 years to 100 years, which goes for a lot of the big road schemes that we're talking about as well. And I find that 100 years is quite a crazy amount of time to be appraising something like a road scheme when we're talking about timescales of 10 years or 30 years to 2050 for some of this for our carbon reduction targets. So the fact that we've got these lengthier time periods in essence as well makes road schemes also artificially more look better from an economic point of view as well.
Just to add to that, I do agree with Chris on that. It's a bizarre suggestion. Nobody knows how you could forecast traffic 100 years into the future. And nobody does it. Nobody even knows how to forecast traffic 60 years into the future, which is the current appraisal.
Which might be too long for the time scales we're talking about anyway.
I think we also, just in terms of appraising, I think you do have to agree what we need to achieve in carbon reduction from the transport sector, and then work out whether what you're doing is a cost-effective way of achieving it. So you're not doing stuff just because it reduces carbon, you're doing things because it reduces carbon more cost-effectively and quicker than some other scheme. And building a road probably isn't going to reduce carbon, and therefore it'll score very badly. And it's to make sure that we've given enough cost to failing. I mean, we may still get climate change, and we can't take the whole blame, but we have to do what transport in the UK has agreed it needs to do to meet the 1.5 degree target. Therefore, what is the most cost-effective way to deliver that and make very, very sure that you are delivering that, because that's the key bit. And then the appraisal will look after itself, because you will be giving benefits to things that in good old cost benefit terms that deliver that carbon reduction at the speed required, and not chasing crazy schemes that are too expensive when you could do something cheaper, quicker, basically.
And also,
I'm just going to add my final in here, because I think that what you've just said there, David, is ultimately sensible. But the issue is that it's not accepted that we can't accommodate traffic growth and road building in order to meet our climate targets. That's the issue. That's not an accepted mantra. It's not accepted in the decarbonisation plan. It's predicated on the fact that electrification is going to mean that we can still be driving around an awful lot. But so you have to look at the technical arguments in order to actually win that argument. And those technical arguments, A, say electrification isn't going to do it and isn't going to do it on time, and B, even if we did go down that route of increasing traffic, now that traffic is only going to be halted by all the things that Phil's outlined down the line. So we can start to talk about the fact that traffic is going to reduce anyway. We're either going to do that proactively or reactively, and that can start to open up, we're hoping, different discussions. So it is a technical argument, but it's also about really trying to imagine the future, that we're honestly having an honest discussion about the fact that traffic is going to have to reduce, and we can either manage that process, or we can leave it for future generations to pick up the costs and the inconvenience of.
Yeah.
Right, I feel we could have a whole webinar just on this one particular point. And I'm biting my tongue because I want to ask some questions, but I'm not going to, because I have a chat box full of questions that I need to go through, which unfortunately won't have time for all of them, but the next one is a juicy one as well. So this one, thanks to Phil and Jillian for a very clear analysis and suggestions for what needs to happen. It is clear we need to reduce traffic urgently, and road pricing has been suggested. However, politicians run scared of this. So how do we persuade people that road pricing is necessary and be desirable and beneficial? Jillian, do you want to have a first stab at that one?
Yeah, I'll have a first stab. So I think one of the first things that we have to do stems from this discussion that we've just had, which is about what the honest conversation about what lies in store for us. So whether it's road pricing or whether it's any other tricky measures that we're talking about, what tends to happen is that politicians and people think, well, that's going to make my life more expensive or more inconvenient. And what they're doing, of course, is comparing that situation, that pricing structure, whatever it might be, to their nice, cozy, affordable lifestyles that we do have most of the time right now. But what they need to be doing is comparing it to what is going to happen if we don't put those measures in place. And this is all part of the same sort of two futures approach that we're talking about. This is an engagement tool as well as it is a technical tool or whatever. We have to start to have the conversation about what will happen if we don't do these things, and try and get people not thinking about comparing things to their lifestyle today. And then one other thing is that I've had the privilege of being involved in a lot of different climate assemblies over the last couple of years, both the National Climate Assembly, but also many local and regional ones. And as we all know, when we've engaged with people, whether it's our family or more professionally, conversations about transport can follow very similar patterns. So you talk to somebody about potentially limiting or reducing a bit their car use at the moment, and they jump to the idea that, well, I can't stop using my car, I can't live without a car, and they jump to extremes. And what I think is really important is to talk about trade-offs and the winners and the losers. So in other words, with respect to pricing, certainly in the assemblies that I've been involved with, if you start to talk about the current fact that the system right now is unfair, it's not about making it unfair through pricing, it's about the fact that it's really unfair right now. Some people are responsible for way more emissions than others. Some people are paying a lot less to get away with emitting way more carbon, and you start to point out those inequalities now, then you don't have to have so much of a battle against the fact that this is going to be unfair. If we introduce it this way, you can start to really talk about the fact that actually there is a potential to make the system fairer through these pricing mechanisms, fairer than it is today.
Just
Go on, Phil. Go on, Phil.
yeah, just to add to that, there was actually a lot of research on the conditions under which road pricing could be acceptable to the public. That's rather different from road pricing being acceptable to politicians. But as far as the public is concerned, a lot of research 10 to 20 years ago, most of it funded by the Department for Transport, in the context of what was seen as the problem then, which was congestion, not climate. And there were two themes of the conditions for public acceptability, which I think were very clear results of that research then, and I think would still be true. The first was you have to outline what the benefits of such a change are, not only the costs. In road pricing, I mean, there are benefits of less traffic, and people are very sensitive to the benefits of less traffic, and they like them very much, and it's one of the routes into it. And the second one was it's very dependent on clarity about what the revenue from road pricing system is going to be spent on. So it's not only about the taking the money away, it's also, well, you've got this money, who are you going to give it to and in what form? And at that time, one of the most common features was it would be much more acceptable if the revenue from road pricing was spent on making a very much higher quality service on public transport for the alternatives that people are now being asked to depend on. It's no good charging me more for my car if I haven't got a train or a bus or an alternative, but it's more acceptable if that alternative is fast and regular and reliable and comfortable and all the rest of it. Now, I think now you'd expand that principle not only to public transport, to the conditions for walking and the conditions for cycling and related questions as well. But it's the same principle. You need to clarify pound for pound what the money is going to be spent on.
I think road user pricing is particularly relevant in urban areas where you're tackling congestion, air quality and carbon, but it'll take too long to implement, and we'll talk about it for ages and do lots of transport planning studies or whatever. I think you can tackle the real problem, which is fossil fuel use, very simply with a road user pricing, which involves putting up the price of fossil fuel. It doesn't penalise electric vehicles. In fact, it encourages the uptake of lower emission vehicles. It encourages the uptake of more efficient vehicles. Doesn't penalise people who have to travel because they don't have an alternative, but it gets you started on what the problem is. Put up the tax on fossil fuel vehicles as quick as you can, announce it as a great idea, and get the price of your petrol and your diesel on a trajectory that will tell people there is no point in buying a new fossil fuel vehicle because you will not be able to sell it in 3 years' time, because everybody will have realised that that's a bad thing to be buying and using. And it is just as simple as put your car tax up and your fossil fuel price up, and maybe give a discount scheme to people who have some good reason for burning fossil fuel, or not, as you see fit. But you don't need a fancy road user charging scheme to tackle carbon, and you can do it quicker with tackling the problem, which is burning fossil fuel.
Only if that tax is hypothecated, though, David.
Absolutely, yeah, and used yeah, absolutely.
And just adding to what Phil was saying as well, I think part of the problem with funding the alternatives is often that people want those alternatives to be the same origin destination, to make the same trip but by a different mode, or by some sort of low carbon mode, or by public transport. And actually, I think what we need to probably have those difficult discussions that actually people might not be able to travel as much or in the same ways.
Yeah. All that whole thing of the patterns of origins and destinations, though, is very much more volatile in the world than we've assumed that it is, for reasons quite other than pricing. It's shifting all the time, and this idea of changing one journey for an exactly identical journey by public transport or whatever isn't really how the world is working. There's a ferment of changes of where you're going and how you're going and what you're going for, even apart from crises like COVID or the effects of Brexit and so on. So you're intervening in a dynamic process rather than a static one. I do agree with David, though. I mean, there is no reason for delay on this. It can be done, and it can be marketed, and it can be expressed what the benefits are. The only people who lose from that are those manufacturers who are totally committed to producing fossil fuel vehicles and feel they're unable to switch to electric vehicles. And I don't know that they are a priority for protection.
That's like saying that we should encourage smoking because there's people working in the tobacco industry whose jobs are important. I mean, it's the wrong, it's a crazy argument.
Let's also get into perspective, though, that the affordability and the supply of electric vehicles is still not for everyone and won't be for quite some time to come. So it's still not a matter of doing this, increasing fossil fuel, the price of fossil fuels in order to encourage a switch to electric vehicles. That cannot happen fast enough, and it can still only happen for those that can afford it in the near term. So there's still a lot to think about what we spend on, what we invest in, and how we make this acceptable for people where electric vehicles just aren't an option.
Yeah, I'm thinking of it as a way of reducing car use rather than an incentive. It has the added benefit of making the argument for electric vehicles, but it's more about reducing the desire to travel in a car on your own long distances.
But if I give you this quick example, we've been doing a longitudinal study from last May, third wave of data from following the same people over the last year. Those people who can't work from home were, before COVID, disproportionately more likely to be car commuters in older fossil fueled vehicles, living on the edge of cities with poorer public transport options, longer distances to travel to work, those kind of medium distances that are difficult to do from anything else. So these are people with less choice because they can't work from home, they don't have that choice, less choice in terms of the cars that they can afford, less choice in terms of the options they have for travelling because of where they live. It very clearly tends to be in less accessible areas. Those are the people we have to think about with any of these types of measures that might increase the cost of travel. It is not easy for those people just to switch or change destinations and shorten their journeys, and especially in the gig economy when they don't know if they're working over there next month or over there next month.
But the extension of that argument then is that nobody needs to change their travel behaviour because everybody who makes a car journey needs to make a car journey, whatever. And you do need to discourage the trips that can be discouraged and have alternatives, and the others that are left, you've achieved your 10%, 20%.
I'm not saying that, but I am saying that a blunt instrument like fuel duty increases still might not be quite the way to go. Something like road pricing and something where you can target it more to places, times, and possibly even other ways of identifying key workers or whatever it might be, may be in the end the only way that we can do this in a way that's fair and acceptable.
Yeah. But we need to do it quickly and with enthusiasm.
Well, I was going to make that point too. I think Jillian, going back to the timescales that you outlined in your presentation, it was somewhere between 5 and 8 years that we have to make the change. So just a quick question from me as my prerogative as chair. Politically, how can we ensure that this happens?
Well, firstly, there are some really core, as I was trying to say, it's still, that timescale is still not accepted. That need to meet those budgets by reducing the amount of traffic on the road or personal passenger traffic is not accepted. There are still core arguments like that to be won because of the different types of baselines and models and assumptions that are used. So there is actually, unfortunately, politically still a manoeuvre to do in terms of getting the argument accepted, let alone the instruments that we can throw at that.
I suppose I think of it really as there is a process not only of persuading the public, but of persuading the politicians. And the dynamics of how you persuade politicians of things are incredibly complicated and not all to do with the sort of world that we live in, where you look at data and rationality and benefit and all the rest of it. I suppose my mental model is that the government may be the last in a chain of pressure, which starts with local campaigning groups and enlightened local authorities and builds up to a regional level, recruiting a sort of core of enlightened politicians in all parties who see the merit of that. And finally, there's a sort of tide of opinion which simply can't be suppressed anymore because there are elections potentially to be lost unless you show a convincing case. Now, I do understand that model applied to the current government is not sure what word to finish that sentence with, difficult, but I don't see any other way of doing it. You have to work with the people who do understand how it's important and try and expand their numbers.
I just worry that we can't. Oh, go on. Sorry, Jillian.
I just say I absolutely totally agree with that. But pessimistic inspirationalism or whatever it might be. Unfortunately, if you look at some of the key NGOs that we have working on transport and decarbonisation, they are still reluctant to come out and call for lower travel demand. If Extinction Rebellion are only just on the page of calling for no road building, believe it or not, so they do absolutely need to come on board, but they are only just coming on board themselves.
Chris, did you want to jump in?
Oh, I think it was largely what Jillian just said, really. I worry that we're not going to win those arguments or achieve that sort of groundswell of support or public opinion in the timescales that sort of Jillian and Phil were sort of setting out in their presentation. I'm just not, it's a pessimistic view, but I'm just not sure it's possible.
So we have, let me just hit my watch, we have 2 minutes left. We could probably stretch it to 4 without being closed down. We've got a lot of questions we haven't been through, but as Juliana said in the chat box, we will circulate those questions to the speakers and hopefully they might have some time to provide some thoughts to everybody. I just wanted to ask each speaker, I don't want to end on false hope in any way, but we have a massive job to do in the next few years, and I refuse to be defeatist. As I said at the beginning, that's not a future I will accept for my son without a fight, at least. So I would love to hear from each of you, maybe just in less than a minute each, some practical and inspiring advice for everybody listening. David, do you want to go first?
It needs a campaign, something like smoking or seatbelts, whatever. Just the concept that you might go out and buy a fossil fuel vehicle, new fossil fuel vehicle, is just ridiculous. So that would be my number one: is what are you doing? Don't do it. Either don't buy a vehicle at all, keep the one you've got, or continue making use of other alternatives. But for goodness sake, do not go out and buy a new fossil fuel vehicle, because it's wrong for the next 15 years. It's going to cause emissions that you are personally responsible for by buying that vehicle.
Great, thank you. Phil, you're next on my screen. Do you want to go next?
I revert to my slogan, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. We've got to do this. If the chances are 80%, we've got to do it. If the chances are 20%, we've got to do it. What I would say is that one of the arguments that we now can use is that cities in particular that have adopted a lower traffic route for other reasons than climate have done so in a way which makes life better, and that the improvements are tangible in terms of quality of life and neighbourliness and all the rest of it. And of course there's other sides to that coin, but nevertheless it can be done. This is a perspective about how to make life better, not only a perspective about how to make life less worse than it will be if we don't. The other thing I'd say is things can change very quickly. You know, you can go on for 20, 30, 40 years and nothing seems to have changed, and then something clicks and there's a tide and you can do it, and it's a question of seizing that moment. Maybe this summer's weather is that trigger. I don't know, but things can change quickly as well as it's not always going to be difficult.
Jillian, you look like you're ready to jump in.
I'm actually going to go with this idea that things can change quickly. The DfT are getting really squeezed into a space. Let's hope Highways England get brought into that fold. They've shortly got nowhere to go. This is a beginning, but I think that once. Right, let's offer a proposal. You heard me say that I'm appalled that they've said they're going to review this plan every 5 years. The pressure has to be on for an independent review of progress every single year to put this pressure on the Department for Transport. I don't know how we get that together. It has to be along CCC type terms, but that's what we need. If we can get that in place, I truly believe that pressure, there's nowhere to go. The numbers are there, the evidence is there, climate change is here. I actually think things could turn quite quickly over the next few years.
Very good.
Thank you. Chris, do you want to have the final word?
Yeah, very, very quickly. I guess following on from what Phil said, I think, and despite my previous pessimistic statement, I think there are positive opportunities here, and I think, as Phil was saying, a lot of the changes we might want to make could actually make people's lives better, and I think we need to link that. I think what we need is for politicians and people in positions of in the public eye, I guess, to actually start linking that to the climate change, to transport, and actually sort of set out the positive vision of what the future could look like. I think that's really important, because we've got these reports and they say we need to do all of this, we need to do all of that. I think it's about actually people in the public eye setting out that positive vision and getting people to come along.
Yep, great, thank you. And my final words would just be to everybody on this call today, everybody listening, thank you so much for listening, but please go away and let's all do everything we possibly can, because the power is collectively in our hands. Thank you so much, Phil Goodwin, Jillian Anable, David Connolly and Chris Robinson for your contributions today. It's been fantastic, a very eye-opening discussion. Thank you so much. And thank you to Landor for organising the webinar, and Juliana will be in touch with how you can access the slides and with the questions. So, and I'm sure information on future events. Thanks so much. Have a good day, everybody. Bye.
Thanks,
Caroline.